The Cincinnati Bengals obviously have some of the best skill players in the NFL, but ESPN's Bill Barnwell thinks they're not at the top of the list. Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Jake Liscow, he's James Rapien, and we are your hosts of the Locked On Bengals podcast, covering the Cincinnati Bengals on this platform since 2016. If you're new to the show, you can subscribe on YouTube or anywhere you can get your podcasts, and well, that makes it very easy to join the many Bengals fans out there that make Locked On Bengals part of their daily routine. Shout out to all the everydayers out there and all of you who make Locked On Bengals your first listen. James, it's ranking season, and in today's episode, brought to the people by FanDuel, where they can get $150, in bonus bets when their first $5 bet wins. We dive into several posts over on ESPN as we're in the NFL 100 season. ESPN's putting up their top 10s, which are based on surveys of those around the NFL. And Bill Barnwell has his annual ranking of skill players in the NFL. And many of you have probably started watching quarterback on Netflix. And well, I looked last night at midnight Pacific time, actually, and it wasn't up yet. And so as of the time of recording, we haven't had a chance to watch it yet. We will be covering it in the future. We might even talk about it a little bit later in this episode, but we won't be diving into quarterback in full today. But James, if I were to ask you, where do the Cincinnati Bengals skill players rank among the skill groups in the NFL? Off the top of your head, what would be your intuitive answer?
Well, I think you instantly start with number one, and then maybe you think about it a little bit, but they have the best receiver in football. That's what Jamar Chase is. And some are going to say, oh, well, no, that's Justin Jefferson, or no, it's this or that. No, it's Jamar. Jamar's the best receiver in football. Triple Crown winner, offensive rookie of the year a few years ago. When he's on the field, there's no one else like him. And so when you start there, and then you throw in another guy who I don't think is a top 10 receiver right now in league circles, but certainly could be this year as he enters his prime, I think a lot of people listening and watching would say number one. I don't think it's that simple. And I don't think it's that simple because there's a lot of good skill groups across the league. A lot of the high-end winning teams, one of which, the Detroit Lions, you're going to see plenty of in quarterback when you watch it with Jared Goff. They are as loaded can be from a skill talent standpoint. Now, Joe Burrow's way better than Jared Goff, but skill players wise, they got a lot of dudes. And there are other teams like that too. So initially, I think a lot of people, including myself, say, all right, well, it's number one. And then you start to look, I think you look around and you're like, oh, well, maybe it's not number one, because Joe Burrow is a big factor here and is probably the number one quarterback in the top 5 or top 10. And we can break that down as we go through the rankings. But that does matter when it comes to evaluating the skill players on the Bengals as well.
Yeah, to be clear, Bill Barnwell's methodology here, just to break down what he's doing, is this is just the wide receivers, tight ends, running back. So quarterback to some might be considered a skill player. I don't know if people out there were considering that Joe Burrow should be factored in, and he's factored in here, but more as a negative than anything because he elevates those players around him. And Bill Barnwell talks about that in his methodology. First, he says this is only about 2025 on-field performance. Then he says injury history and suspensions matter. He talks about T. Higgins and Christian McCaffrey in that article. And then he says that wide receivers are weighted more heavily than running backs or tight ends as a reflection of the NFL, although there might be a bit of an argument about elite tight ends and their ability to be transformative in offenses. And he also talks about how playing with a guy like Joe Burrow makes everyone else's life easier. And you mentioned the top 10. The number one team, maybe we start from number 10. Let's start from number 10, shall we?
Let's do that, yes.
Miami Dolphins ranking 10th, and that's down from 3rd in 2024 when everyone thought that their skill players were awesome, and they were. They have more speed than any team in the NFL. Miami was a team that we talked about several times when we were talking about, well, if the Bengals could get one more speed piece to do some of what Miami does. Atlanta at number 9. That one's a little bit surprising to me, but Bijan Robinson doing a lot of work for Atlanta there. Baltimore up from 15 all the way to 8 on the heels of Derrick Henry having an awesome season in that offense. I don't think DeAndre Hopkins should move the needle much, but the emergence of Isaiah Likely perhaps is a more consistent threat in that offense, and Zay Flowers, obviously, that sort of makes sense to me. Tampa Bay at 7 with a great trio of wide receivers and an awesome rookie performance from Bucky Irving. Minnesota at 6, led by Justin Jefferson, obviously. Los Angeles Rams all the way up to 5. That one a little bit surprising to me, but I guess adding Devontae Adams is a needle mover. San Francisco down to 4 from 1. And then we get to the top 3. But what do you think of 10 through 6 when we're thinking about this? Do we think any of those are competing directly with the Bengals?
No, I think the Jamar T tandem is better than anything that Miami, Atlanta, Baltimore, Tampa, or Minnesota is trotting out there. Now, if Tampa had a healthy Chris Godwin and he wasn't coming off of an ACL, that changes things. I mean, then they're probably right there. But you're talking about Mike Evans, who's still playing at a high level, but he's not Jamar at this stage. And then you're talking about Chris Godwin coming back, and they have some nice depth behind him. But I can see why they would be where they are. That's the team, though, out of all of these that I look at, and I'm like, well, they could certainly be up higher. And then Minnesota is the other one where they have an elite 1-2 punch, Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. And then you have TJ Hawkinson, who, if he regains his form this year, coming back from the ACL, that's as good of a trio of pass catchers as you're going to have 2 receivers and 1 tight end. Like, it's going to be a really high-end group there. So a lot of good groups. I would still take the Bengals guys over everyone mentioned so far.
Aaron Jones also
Aaron Jones,
productive
solid
back for Minnesota last year. I would say Miami is one that, if they can stay healthy, there's a potential for Miami to jump back up this list just because they still have all that speed. And that includes the backfield there. They just don't really have a tight end. I mean, they signed Darren Waller. And so if Darren Waller can suddenly come back to the NFL and be good again, then you could see them jump back up. The Bengals are 3rd. And we're going to dive into that. But the Bengals are 3rd. The Detroit Lions are 2nd on this list. And the Philadelphia Eagles are 1st. And I think that gets pretty darn interesting. The Lions in particular. And I think it's harder to argue for me that the Bengals have a better skill group than the Eagles, because the Eagles go deep at all 3 spots. And so do the Lions, to be honest. But the Lions-Bengals comparison, the Big Cat comparison in this top 3 is a little bit interesting. So let's dive in a little bit more to the top 3 here that sees the Bengals coming in at 3rd in Bill Barnwell's skill position rankings coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book, and summer sports are in full swing. And whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. And NFL training camp is just a few weeks away. So when it comes to the NFL futures, when you're watching Joe Burrow on quarterback, well, go to FanDuel and check out the NFL futures, because the Bengals are hoping to bounce back, of course. And FanDuel is awesome because you can track your favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions, fun ways to bet, and it's super easy to use. The payouts are super fast, so don't delay. Get to FanDuel today, and new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins at FanDuel.com. Again, bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today and visit FanDuel.com to get started.
Right off the bat, any hot takes when you see Bengals, Lions, Eagles in the top 3?
I think no, not really. Not a hot take. I could certainly make the case that the Bengals are ahead of the Lions, but the Lions, they have that elite running back. On our last show, I talked about Chase Brown and if he could get to that next level. Like that's probably the path to the Bengals being one next year, because Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are probably the best tandem in the league. Like I would take them over maybe any 1-2 running back. And I haven't done it. I haven't looked at every tandem, but boy, oh boy, like what would you rather have, those two guys or Saquon Barkley? And Saquon Barkley's coming off of a crazy season, but you can make that case. You'd rather have the 1-2 punch because they balance each other out well. And the Bengals, they don't have that. So the big edge when you're looking at it and comparing these, well, Jamar's better than AJ Brown. Jamar's better than Amon-Ra St. Brown. But Chase Brown isn't better than David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs. Chase Brown obviously isn't Saquon Barkley. And so that's where I think the edge is when you're looking at breaking the tie in some of these spots. So not shocked at all, especially with the Lions. I think Jared Goff, and maybe you'll see this on quarterback, like I said, he's elevated by the skill guys around him some. And honestly, the same thing goes for Jalen Hurts. I think Jalen Hurts is really good. I don't think he's Joe Burrow. I don't think he's some of these other guys. And that matters when you're splitting hairs and trying to decide, all right, top skill group, second best, and third best.
I think for Detroit, the coordinator will be fascinating to reflect on
doubt.
as well, with his departure, Ben Johnson leaving Detroit, going to Chicago to be the head coach. How much was Ben Johnson playing up that skill group? I mean, not to say they're not really good players. Amon-Ra St. Brown, obviously really good. Jamison Williams getting his stuff together in Detroit and being a productive player for a wide receiver too. That's a pretty good starting point. And then when you have that backfield and Sam Laporta in the mix, who is a significantly better tight end than the Bengals have, because he can actually do tight end things. Not to take anything away from Mike Gesicki, but Gesicki is a receiver. The Bengals essentially don't have a tight end that you would consider for these rankings. They have four guys at receiver that you're talking about, with Jamar at the top, Gesicki, and Andre Yosevach in the conversation at receiver. That's how they use those guys on their roster. And Mike Gesicki is kind of nominally a tight end, but in reality, when you're comparing to Dallas Goedert and Sam Laporta, they play different positions, although both of those guys very prolific as wide receivers. And
would you?
It's the where this gets interesting. Sorry, is just that Barmel is weighting wide receivers heavier, right? And so T and Jamar, you'd obviously rather have than Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams, but maybe that's closer to some than to us, because Amon-Ra St. Brown is really, really good and he doesn't have Joe Burrow throwing him the ball. I think a lot of the offensive production in Detroit was a result of Ben Johnson's ingenuity and his play calling. So I think that is going to be really interesting. But yeah, I think this is one of those where the tight end and running back combination in Detroit was just too much. And Barmel does respect what Chase Brown did. I thought this was really interesting. Over his 8-game stretch as a primary back for Cincinnati after Zach Moss got hurt, Chase Brown's numbers would extrapolate to a full season of 321 carries, 81 receptions, and just south of 2,000 yards from scrimmage, 12 touchdowns, which is pretty close to what Bijan Robinson did in 2024. And now we're not projecting Chase Brown to get that kind of workload, but those numbers, his pace in those 8 games when he was the guy and he was on the field nonstop for the Bengals, those are some pretty impressive numbers. Nearly 2,000 yards from scrimmage.
Would you? It is. Would you? Do you think the Bengals are number one if Sam Laporta is in stripes? Let's just say they take Sam Laporta 28th overall. Like, does that change it? Because it may change it. Like if or if they had signed Saquon last offseason, which was never a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does that change it? Because that's what Bill's saying, essentially.
I think it gets them to 2. I still don't think it would get them ahead of the Eagles, because the Eagles have it all. Like, they have the comparable wide receivers. AJ Brown is awesome. I'd still rather have the Bengals' top 2 guys and the Eagles' top 2 guys at receiver. But it's closer than anyone else in the NFL, I think.
Yeah.
And then just like Saquon and Goddard, are still really good.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. And that's where it is. That's how tough it is. And by the way, so draft season, I get it every single year where I talk about a skill guy and I'm like, man, if you get that guy, can you imagine? And this is just a fun, wild nugget where if the Bengals let me draft, maybe it would have happened, even though we weren't focused on a ton of receivers after they picked Jamar Chase. Can you imagine if they had just taken Amon-Ra St. Brown instead of Jackson Carman? Everyone talks about the other linemen, including me. Like Creed Humphrey was there, all these guys. Can you imagine? People would have rioted, and then they would have trotted out there Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and who knows how long Tyler Boyd would have been in town in that scenario. But it was there. Like it could have, they'd be number one in that scenario. Had they done that, they'd be number one.
Well, in that scenario, Amon-Ra St. Well, one of those guys isn't a Bengal anymore.
Not now.
They're not paying all three, but last year.
But they have a couple rings on their finger too, probably.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty good shot at that.
Yeah.
Burrow would need to stay healthy. They would need to keep some offensive linemen healthy because
they won the Super Bowl. Tyler Boyd stunk in the Super Bowl. Amon-Ra St. Brown would have probably been better even as a rookie. And then the year after, Tyler Boyd gets hurt. Maybe Amon-Ra St. Brown doesn't get hurt, and just like
deep in the hypotheticals.
But how about that? I'm just saying but that's it. Is getting a good player matters, even if it seems like it's at a position of depth. I also think that when looking at this, like who would you consider the Eagles wide receiver 3? Because I think Andre Yosevach, and now we're deep, like you said. But I think Andre Yosevach might have the edge there. Without looking, I haven't looked at the Eagles wide receiver 3. I'm about to right now.
I've got it here. It's
Jahan Dotson. Yeah, give me Andre. Give me Andre. I didn't know if they had replaced Jahan Dotson.
They got Terrace Marshall this year.
No chance.
Trying to revive that career. Johnny Wilson.
Oh yeah.
Aeneas Smith.
So the Bengals have the edge there, like a big edge. Like the Eagles would love Andre. To your point though, they have the tight ends and the running back, and so
AJ Dillon, Will Shipley, running backs 2 and 3, and we'll see how those shake out. Great offensive line, obviously, in Philly. Grant Calcaterra, tight end 2, would be a starter for the Bengals. Different position than Mike Gesicki, again, to make that clear. But I think
better than Drew Sample is what you're saying.
Maybe I'm wrong. He's only 240. Maybe he's not big enough to do those things. I guess I need to go watch him before I make those kinds of bold claims. But
bold claims.
I do think there's an argument here with the Lions and how much you think those running backs matter, how much you're buying Sam Laporta's bounce back. And this was all based on 2024, I think, right? That's what the methodology was. It was based on last year's on-field performance. And I think it's harder to make an argument with the Eagles. I think the Eagles showed that those skill guys are pretty tough to make that argument.
Yeah. Well, because to your point, the receiver part of it, they're close.
Mm-hmm.
AJ Brown isn't Jamar. You can argue that Devontae Smith is T in a different way and can be as effective and as productive. I don't necessarily think that, because 6'4", 225, that the strength, the high point, you saw it against Denver. Like T, when he's healthy, is a top 10 receiver in my mind. I really believe that now.
But health is a part of this, right? And
no doubt.
One of the sentences that he writes about the Bengals is the only things holding the Bengals back are the hamstrings of T. Higgins. It's a line in the article.
If he does stay healthy this year, there's a path for them to be number one, because having what if they have 2 top 8 receivers? What if Jamar goes for 2,000 and T goes for 1,300? And if they stay healthy, that's not crazy. Like if this, it sounds crazy, but it's not, because they're going to throw it all over the field if that's the case and those guys are healthy.
It is ranking season, James.
Yeah, baby.
We got through the skill guys there. The Bill Barnwell skill group rankings. ESPN has started their annual list of top 10s by position group. They've got 2 of them out so far for us to catch up on: running back and defensive tackle. We'll dive into those coming up next.
Ranking season continues, and not only was Chase Brown not a top 10 running back, he didn't receive any votes. Did that surprise you, given the way he finished last year and was as productive, over 13 plus yards, 1,300 plus yards from scrimmage, 11 touchdowns combined, 4 receiving, 54 catches. I mean, showed you the receiving ability, the running ability, easily gets to 1,000 yards rushing had he not gotten hurt against the Broncos on that weird ending. What do you feel, or how do you feel about Chase Brown not even getting a vote for the top 10?
And this pass protection took such a huge leap.
That's true. Good point. Yep.
And the Bengals offense, that's crazy important. And maybe it's just not valued as highly among those who voted. So this is a survey of executives, coaches, and scouts that Jeremy Fowler and ESPN put together every year. Matt Bowen is part of this as well. And I was a little surprised he didn't get a single vote. But most of the guys that did get votes make a lot of sense to me. Most of the guys that were ranked ahead of him, I can at least, see where people are coming from. There's a little bit more longevity for some of these guys, or they managed to do it for a full season. I do think that the half season of being the full-time guy holds Chase Brown back a little bit, and maybe finishing with an injury and being on the Bengals in a year where they were a letdown doesn't help. But Chuba Hubbard got a vote from the Carolina Panthers.
And he was good.
He was good. But if Chuba Hubbard's getting a vote, Chase Brown can get a vote, right?
Agreed. I agree. I think he will get serious consideration for the top 10. And if I was forecasting, this is based on last year. If I was forecasting this, I really believe that there's a realistic path that Chase Brown has a better 2025 season than Alvin Kamara, who was 10th, and Joe Mixon, who was 9th, and maybe more. Maybe he completely passes Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey has another injury or two. He's all 3 of those guys are in the same class. That isn't going to last for all 3. I'm not sure exactly who, but if Chase Brown takes another step, I would expect to see him. Let's say he goes for 1,500 plus yards from scrimmage this year. If that happens, which is only a couple hundred yards more than he did last year, under that, he's going to be in the top 10 next year, or at least he should be.
Yeah, Kamara has some of that respect from doing it for a while now.
And he should. NFL. He's been awesome. Yeah, he should.
And Joe Mixon going from honorable mention back to the top 10 this year. Previously, his highest ranking was 5th. James Cook in the top 10 as well, as he's waiting for a contract there. I do think it might be tough for Chase Brown to crack the top 10. I think he should get votes if he puts together a healthy season and plays the way he did last year. I think that will be too hard to ignore. But the honorable mentions here all had good seasons. Well, for the most part, had good seasons anyway. Bucky Irving and Aaron Jones, both very productive. James Conner, underrated in Arizona, very productive last year. Breece Hall played for the Jets last year. That's the team that employs him. I don't know what the Jets did last year. I'm going to be real with you on that one.
I think Breece is good.
I think he's good too, but I have no idea what he did last year. And Devin Achane? I'm trying to remember how his name.
Achane.
I thought it was a soft. Anyway, I'm surprised that one's in there.
A lot of people say Achane, and it's Achane.
I thought it was a soft CH. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Had a ton of production through the air last year, nearly 600 yards receiving on 78 receptions and 900 yards on the ground. He fell off a little bit in terms of yards per carry from that 7.8 as a rookie to 4.5 in his second season with nearly double the carries. Really good. Was healthy for the full year. But again, if he's getting votes, I feel like Chase Brown can get a vote because they're both similar in terms of total production. He was more productive last year. Don't get me wrong. But I do think that if you get a season of healthy Chase Brown, he's getting a vote. I don't know if he's in the top 10, but I think he's getting a vote.
We'll see. It would be great if for the Bengals, like I said, if he got to the top 10. You know what would be even better? Jake?
Yeah.
If they had a defensive tackle that got real votes. because they didn't. And when I opened it, and I'm sure when you opened it, you knew there was going to be none. And I knew they weren't going to be in the top 10. And I wasn't expecting BJ Hill or TJ Slayton or obviously Chris Jenkins, McKinley Jackson to be in the top 10. But next year, can one of these guys get a vote? Can they be good enough to get a vote, Jake? That's the bar for me. If one of those guys gets a vote, you're going to feel really darn good, I think, about at least part of the Bengals defensive tackle room. And that's what they need. You want to talk about where they were during that Super Bowl run, and I mentioned some of that earlier in the show. DJ Reader, even if he didn't get real top 10 looks, and I can't remember if he did or not at all during he was a top 10 defensive tackle when he was out there because he mattered that much. I not that they needed to be DJ Reader. It would be nice if there was some pressure that came with it, but it would be really nice if one of these guys played well enough to get a vote next year.
Yeah, I would love that. I have a pretty tough time projecting it.
I'm making a face for those listening.
I don't know how you could predict such a massive leap. I mean, the guys that are up there for defensive tackles are all like cream of the crop kind of players. And I'm just looking to see if DJ Reader did get votes as recently as 2023. So at least there's that. But I mean, we're talking about comparing to Dexter Lawrence, Chris Jones, Jalen Carter, Jeffrey Simmons, Quinnen Williams, Leonard Williams, Nnamdi Madubuike, DeForest Buckner, Vita Vea, Cam Hayward, Christian Wilkins, Derek Brown, Zach Allen, Kenny Clark, Aleem McNeil. I mean, those guys are in a different class than anything that the Bengals have right now. I think you're talking about a 2-year project. You're hoping that one of these guys can develop and in 2 years get votes like Osa Odigizua got a vote or two, got some votes. He's listed in the also receiving votes section. Kalijah Cansey getting some votes. Deron Payne getting some votes. If one of the Bengals young guys can turn into one of those guys,
yeah,
that would be exceeding expectations right now. I don't think there's a player on this roster right now that's going to crack the top 15 defensive tackles in the NFL.
And that's why we were talking about a Walter Nolan pre-draft, right? Is like that could be the guy that realistically, you look up and he is Kalijah Cansey. And is that guy that's young, starting to blossom, starting to give you something. Johnny Newton 2 years ago, we talked about him. Like you could kind of see that. I agree with you. I don't necessarily see that for Chris Jenkins Jr. or McKinley Jackson. I don't think TJ Slayton or BJ Hill are that at this stage. We know what they are. And so you're hoping that the sum of that quartet is greater together than it is separately, because it doesn't feel like they'll have one of those guys that is a top 15 defensive tackle or gets a vote or gets consideration. And that stinks. That just, it stinks. I'm not blaming anyone. Guess you could blame the powers that be, but yeah, that's a rough place to be, just because, it was such a weakness and has been such a weakness over the past year plus.
Something that they really haven't valued very highly until it became obvious and they were desperate, and then they used the second round pick. And Chris Jenkins should be better this year. I'm not trying to say that Chris Jenkins can't be a good player. That's not what I'm getting at here. But when you think about some of the names on this list, I mean, these are difference makers that offensive coordinators are game planning for. Mm-hmm. And you have to have, protection rules for these guys, or you have to deal with them in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not all of them, but the guys in the top 10 are game wreckers. Mm-hmm. And it's been way too long since the Bengals had a game wrecker there. And I would put DJ Reader in that category at his peak when he was playing well for Cincinnati. He's in that category. I would put him up there with a lot of these guys for what he did for this defense. But there's nothing approximating that on the Cincinnati Bengals roster right now.
No, there's not. And I think they were hoping that Sheldon Rankins would be that last year when they signed him, is be kind of a game-wrecking pass rusher. Obviously, that didn't work out, and he's back to Houston on a value deal. So step up. Someone, please step up. Get a few votes next year. If Chris Jenkins Jr. and McKinley Jackson, if they get a few votes next year, you're feeling really good. Much better in the offseason, I would say, about that defensive tackle room, because they that means one of those guys showed up and played at a high level. And who knows, maybe TJ Slayton being here can help unlock one of those guys. But I think that's wishful thinking.
The only defensive position that I think will see any votes for the Bengals would be Logan Wilson at linebacker. The safeties aren't getting votes. The ends aren't. Well, Trey Hendrickson's definitely getting a vote. I forgot about Trey.
Trey Hendrickson will be top
Hendrickson's
5
My
to
bad.
8, probably at the worst 8.
Yeah, Trey's definitely in there. My bad. I forgot about that one. And we will get edge rushers maybe by the time you're listening to this episode. But corners aren't getting a vote. Safeties aren't getting a vote. The rest of the ends aren't getting a vote. Logan Wilson might get some votes.
Yeah. I don't think he does. I don't think he was that good last year. And so I maybe he gets a vote because of name recognition. You're right, like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he was a top 15 linebacker in the league.
Yeah.
And maybe he will be, but I don't think he was last year.
Got to see some guys step up on defense. That's a consistent theme of these offseason episodes of Locked On Bengals. An inconsistent theme of these offseason episodes of Locked On Bengals has been Joe Burrow's appearance on a TV show. We have not spent a lot of time talking about that, but quarterback is out there, and we're gonna try to get some quarterback viewing in, and barring unforeseen developments between now and Thursday, that may be the topic of our next show here. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.